We're going to talk about the SNIA 100-Year Archive Survey. This survey was done about 10 years ago, and it was decided to redo the survey after 10 years. So this is going to be a discussion on the changes to what the survey is today, which, by the way, is going live this week. So at the end, we will encourage you to please take the survey and help us with some of the results. And thank you for coming today. We will have some time for questions, so feel free to ask either during the presentation, or if you'd like to wait to the end, that's okay too. So whatever you're most comfortable with. I did used to teach for a living, so I do normally walk around with a little stick. So if anybody tries to fall asleep, I will tap you on the shoulder. So try and stay awake, please. So the original survey was done by one of our technical working groups called the Long-Term Retention Twig. Internally, we like to refer to it as the LTR twig. So if you hear LTR twig, you now know what I'm talking about. And to help that group out, one of the groups that I co-chair, which is the Data Protection Committee, otherwise known as the DPCO, we assisted the LTR twig in redoing the survey after the 10 years that have transpired. For additional information on both the LTR twig or some of the work we're doing in the Data Protection Committee, feel free to follow those URLs. This presentation is also up on the SNIA.org website, so you'll be able to download this presentation if you like. So first of all, what's the need for archiving, the need for digital preservation? There's a couple things going on. Obviously, there's a bunch of regulatory compliance going on, not just in the US, although some of the examples I give are examples of US-based compliance issues. For example, HIPAA, FRCP, Sarbanes-Oxley are some examples of some compliance issues that are specific to the US, but there are some others that are outside the US that would be other examples as well. Certainly, the emergence of a lot of different web applications, as well as a bunch of services. A good example would be photos, where you want to maintain or maybe keep photos, but use an external web service to do that. Hence the need for the ability to keep this data around for a long period of time. Also, a lot of other media and entertainment. Obviously, all the movie houses are storing their data, not just internally. Some of them are using external cloud services to do that as well, especially for those that are doing streaming services for end users and consumers. Then a lot of the companies that are in the business of making money by mining data, this term of big data, doing a lot of the analytics that we're seeing. Well, there's a huge need to maintain that data for a long period of time. In fact, it's almost counterintuitive when you think of the typical company where they might want to keep or retain their data for a specified time frame. After that time frame transpires, they might want to delete it. Well, oddly enough, there's actually companies that don't want to delete it after a certain amount of time. In fact, their data over a period of time actually increases in value. Any ideas why it would increase in value over time?
Because it can't be reproduced?
Well, number one, it can't be reproduced, and they have a need for analyzing that data. Well, in some cases, the analyzing of that data will actually give them more information over a period of time. So, for example, if it's only a week old, well, you can't do much analyzation on that. If it's 3 years old or even longer, the ability to mine that data for specific use cases and potentially to sell that resulting data to other companies is actually a profit-generating area for many companies. Google comes to mind, but there are many, many examples of where they actually purposely keep data for a long period of time to use that data so that they can sell the results of the analysis of that data to external parties. Does that make sense? So what are some of the goals? Well, you want to be able to store this data for whatever the time period is, but still have it accessible, make sure that it's still in a state where it's not damaged, and then be able to use it for whatever the time frame is that you're saving it. You also want to be able to have access to that data regardless of the storage system that it's stored on. And you want to be able to have the ability to move that data potentially from one vendor's storage subsystem to another over a period of time for a variety of reasons. Maybe the company goes out of business, that storage system vendor that is. It could be that you decide to go down a different technology path with a different vendor. You might actually decide to go to a totally different storage media. That might have been spinning disk. It's now maybe going to optical. Maybe it's going to all flash. Who knows? And be able to continue to access that data over a period of time. For those that are doing very, very long-term storage, this is, believe it or not, one of the biggest issues is how do I maintain access to that data, not just tomorrow or next week or next year, but how do I do it from 10, 15, 20 years from now, when in fact that it's possible that some of that data starts to become unusable because the technology starts to wear. It's a big issue. Of course, the last on this slide being you want to be able to do it at an affordable cost. You don't want it to be terribly expensive, obviously. So what are some of the threats to the long-term assets? So if you want to archive data, some of the issues are obviously disasters. Some of them are natural disasters that you don't have control over. Some could be human error. Some could be faults of the media faults. Of the three that are listed, any ideas as to actually what is the most common issue of the three? Human error. There's been a lot of studies done that of all the natural disasters, of all the issues with the access to specific media over a period of time, by far, human error is the most troublesome issue, oddly enough. So you have some other internal things. You have component, economic, maybe some external attacks, either from other countries or from specific parties that might be within your country or external, meaning not associated with any specific government necessarily, and potentially organizational issues as well. And I mentioned this a little earlier, the media/hardware obsolescence. Again, short-term, typically not an issue. Longer term, if you're trying to keep this data for a long period of time, that's going to become an issue and how you deal with it. As a prelude to one of the things I'll talk about a little bit later, the long-term retention twig has come up with a standard. It's actually soon to go to ISO to become a global standard, and that's referred to as SIRF. Anybody hear of SIRF? S-I-R-F? Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about the self-contained information retention format, which is what SIRF stands for. And that's to help with some of these issues of things like media/hardware obsolescence, to give you the ability to have that data in a form that then can be transferred to some other type of device or media type. So when we originally did this survey 10 years ago, so that's hence the reason why you see listed 2007, there's a couple of goals. The goal being, what are the requirements? You know, get the people responding to the survey to find out, well, what are the requirements? How long do you need to retain data? And by the way, why are you retaining data in the first place? The idea was that, well, it'd be interesting to find out, at the time it was more talking on the terabyte size versus today we're talking petabytes and higher. what are some of the issues that they're seeing in the ability for their organization to store data for a long period of time. So some of the results of that survey that came out 10 years ago, I'm just highlighting a few of the examples of what came out of the survey. One of the questions was, what does long-term mean? Well, come to find out that retention of 20 years or more was actually a requirement of over 70% of the respondents of the survey 10 years ago. Well, 20 years is actually a pretty long time, and to realize that over 70% of the respondents said, yeah, that's one of their requirements, was kind of eye-opening for us, even 10 years ago. One of the other things that we asked 10 years ago was, what are the top external factors driving the long-term retention requirements? You'll see on the bar chart, I list them here on the side in either blue or purple. I'm not really sure. You have to help me out here because I'm a little bit color deficient. Some people tell me that's blue. Some people say it's purple. I have no idea. What is it, by the way, down here? Nobody knows.
Right between them.
Right between them, good. So I don't feel so bad because I can't discern what the color is.
The SDC logo is purple.
Okay, good. Good, so I won't feel so bad. So anyway, down here, you got these were the major requirements that came out of the survey 10 years ago. Probably to many of you, probably not too eye-opening. Obviously the security, the risk, and the risk to the business was very, very high up on the list. Some of the legal issues were an issue back then, even more so today, more so than it was 10 years ago. Some of those legal issues actually is coming out of some of the compliance requirements, not just in the US, but in places like the European Union. So has anybody heard of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations coming out of the EU? There'll be a separate talk on GDPR in about an hour in Stevens Creek. I only know because I happen to be the one that will be talking about it. And we'll be talking specifically about some of those GDPR requirements and how that affects organizations and what they do. If you're interested, that's at 3:05 this afternoon. And that's driving, getting back to archive, that's driving a lot of the requirements for making sure that data is retained. So some of the key findings from the survey that was done 10 years ago is here. For example, the logical and physical retention. The issues were generally understood. When we asked long-term, what did that mean to organizations 10 years ago when we did it, it typically meant a minimum 10 to 15 years when they defined long-term storage to us. We're actually finding, as we are getting responses back from the survey that's officially live this week, we're actually finding that this number, 10 to 15 years, is actually higher now, which is kind of interesting. I would have expected that, but it'll be interesting to see as we get more and more respondents of the survey as time goes on. And the fact that the requirements are real. To me, this was kind of eye-opening from the survey 10 years ago. And this is at the bottom of the slide. For those that can't read it at the bottom, I'll sort of read it to you. So over 80% of the organizations reporting having a need to retain information for over 50 years. 68% report a need to retain information for over 100 years. Keep in mind, this was results from the survey on archiving 10 years ago. That's a high number in both numbers, in both bullets. Can you think of a couple of different industries where they would have potentially a need to store information for a long period of time, say 80 years or maybe longer? What are some of those industries that may have a need to do that? Vertical industries. Financial is a great one. I didn't hear the second one, but climate is another one, right? So the scientific community that wants to do research on climate and its change over a period of time. Well, they have an express need to not just record the data today, they want to actually record it over a long period of time so they can see what those trends are. What's another one, though, that we haven't? Financial, climate, utilities, right? Utilities are great one. What's another one? Yeah, insurance companies, they want to see trends over a long period of time. That helps them to build their business and maybe make changes in their business to help with what those trends are. How about the medical industry, right? So you have companies that actually manufacture devices that maybe take x-rays or MRIs, and the list goes on. And then they're selling those devices to companies that are health providers. Those health providers, depending on the country that you're in, actually, there are requirements in certain countries to actually retain that information for a specified time frame. So to give you a few examples, there are some countries that require you to retain the medical information, whatever it is, x-rays, MRIs, whatever medical information you have on any given patient, to retain that data for 7 years after the person has passed away. Again, that's specific to country, right? So that's not global, but depending on the country that you live in. There are others that say, well, you have to keep it for a minimum of 20 years after the image has been taken. So, for example, you take an x-ray, you got to keep it for 20 years, minimum. A lot of litigation has taken place in the medical industry such that to make sure, based on medical malpractice, which is very common, unfortunately, here in the US, that they're finding legally that it's actually better for them to retain that information for as long as possible so that at least they have the information to be able to dispute any claim within a court of law. On the flip side of that, so forget about medical industry for a minute, in the general business industry, and I'll give the example of the US one more time, some companies actually will set up policies for their, I'll give you an example, email. So they will say, and again, this is specific to the US because we're such a litigious society, unfortunately. Many times the information infrastructure, the IT department will say, okay, retain the data, but we want all non-essential email to be deleted after 1 year. I've actually worked for a company where they actually delete email after 6 months. Very different from the example I gave you previously, which was the medical industry. Why would a company in the US want to delete email over a short period of time, like say 6 months? Well, why would they set up a policy like that? Any ideas?
Equally for legal reasons for e-discovery.
Yeah, so also for legal reasons, but it's sort of the flip side of the medical industry. So the general company that might be sued, either from a former employer or maybe from an external provider to that company, regardless of the specific lawsuit, if they are in fact sued, typically the opposing counsel will request data, information. And typically they'll call that e-discovery. So that means they have to put a hold, what they call a legal hold, on all data at the time of their e-discovery request, and then provide that data within a specified time frame to opposing counsel. They don't care how much time it takes your IT department to extract that data and give it to them, but that's a requirement. So to combat that issue, a lot of the organizations, at least in the US, because it's such a litigious society, are actually setting up policies to have a very short retention cycle for things like email, because there's a potential for using that against the company. And so if it's discoverable, good or bad, it can be used against you.
Well, question. There's an assumption that you're engaged in an email conversation with most likely the organization suing you. Now, we all have our limited accuracy of our memory, and if they were to provide something fabricated, how could you refute that? And it's like, oh, maybe I said that. I don't recall, and I can't prove it because I'm under policy to aggressively flush that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So,
The medical field where, well, we're covering our behinds by...
sure. Yeah, so in the case of e-discovery, and I guess I should make the claim now, I am not a lawyer, so don't expect me to provide legal advice. I will say that for the next talk later this afternoon when I talk about the GDPR regulations in the European Union. Having said that, it is true that you might have opposing counsel state that certain things were done which they cannot prove based on the emails that you kept. Now, keep in mind that that's just the emails that the organization kept. That doesn't mean that emails are not out there that were sent from people within that organization prior to the time that the deletion took place. So just because you delete email within your company doesn't mean that some of those emails that were sent are deleted also. It could be those that it were delivered to outside the company where it still exists. Yep. Absolutely. So that's a common issue. The flip side of that is if opposing counsel comes and they say, well, you have to provide that. If you have a policy where it was deleted because it's more than 6 months old, you have no obligation to provide something that you don't have because your policy was to get it deleted, which gets you out of some legal issues potentially. So that's the thought there. So 10 years later, we decided to assist the LTR, the long-term retention twig, in coming out with a new survey. Why did we decide to do that? Well, there's a whole bunch of solutions that are available today that were not available 10 years ago. Some of those are listed on the screen. I'm not going to read those to you, but gives you an idea of what was available and what is available now, which wasn't available 10 years ago. Also, usage is still limited. So some of these that we list here are being used, but they're kind of limited to a lot of the scientific, a lot of the government agencies are using some of these. They're not really seen too much in the general organizations outside government and scientific and university environments, at least not yet. So the next question is, well, why aren't organizations using all this wonderful new stuff that's available today? Part of it is education. They don't know about it. Part of it is that they don't understand it. Some of it is, well, they don't need to use it. So why would I implement it if I don't have anything that's requiring me to use any of these fancy services that are available? But also a lot of the organizations have a very, very short-term focus, and they're not really thinking about storing things for a long, long period of time if in their business mind they don't have an immediate need to feel that they need to do that, at least today. So we kind of refer to that as a short-term focus. Very different from those companies that are out there that where their business is to mine data, and they actually make more data the more data that they have available, which means they want to retain it for a long period of time. People like Google and Facebook, they have very, very immediate needs to store data and then store it as long as they can, because then they can mine that data and then sell it to other marketing folks. Whether we like it or not, that's another subject. So we decided to, we meaning the Data Protection Committee and helping the long-term retention twig, come up with a new survey to actually ask some new questions. Questions that we couldn't ask 10 years ago because some of this stuff just didn't exist. But also to see what the trends were. You know, what are organizations concerned with today that they weren't concerned with 10 years ago? A great example is some of the regulatory stuff that we're dealing with today. Some of it was just starting 10 years ago, and some of it didn't exist 10 years ago. Who needs to retain the information? What policies would you be setting up as part of that retention format? What practices have been evolving in the last 10 years since we did the last survey? And then how is that long-term information stored? How is it secured? How is it preserved? And those are all questions within the new survey that's live this week. And I will stop there for 1 minute. I see a few people are taking notes. For those that walked in late, feel free to ask questions along the way. We'll also have time, a little bit of time at the end for questions as well. So some of the emerging changes is obviously cloud. Well, we didn't really have much of a cloud discussion 10 years ago when we did the initial survey. A lot of the software as a service. A lot of different services out there today that just wasn't available yet. Goes without saying that the data volume, you guys know that and you've heard that in just about every talk, right? Much more data being generated today than ever before. There's been a migration from what we used to call CAS, or content addressable storage, now much more referred to as an object storage, and some will refer to also as WORM NAS devices, network attached storage devices. A lot more use of those types of technologies. There's a lot of discussion in many organizations today about what's the viability of existing tape technologies, and then some of the optical storage technologies. Much more rigor in going through some of the qualification of those technologies in terms of viability, much more than there was 10 years ago. Why? Because there's a need to store that data for even longer periods of time than there was even 10 years ago. Another one is the emergence of some of these new standards in the formats of the data, the preservation formats. One of those standards I happened to mention at the beginning of the talk, SIRF, or SIRF for short, Self-Contained Information Retention Format, was a standard that actually came out of the long-term retention twig here in SNIA. Actually is going to ISO shortly for becoming a global standard. So those are some of the things that are being worked on today. Weren't even on the drawing board 10 years ago. And lastly, the need for some of the regulatory requirements, many of which were not even on the radar 10 years ago when we did the initial survey. So who are we targeting for the new survey coming out? Well, certainly we want to have people that are familiar with IT, their respective staffs, managers, directors of IT, and so on. And what are the systems and technologies that they're dealing with. Some of the others would be specific groups, business groups. Some examples in the government community, for example, would be the Library of Congress. We actually had several people from the Library of Congress help us craft some of the questions within our survey that we just came out with live this week. Some of the scientists some of which are plucked in universities throughout the U.S. that deal with issues of long-term archive. Librarians, when I say librarians, those are typical digital librarians. Library of Congress is a great example. And then some of the legal folks that are dealing with not just the IT aspect of how you archive the data, but what are the legal ramifications around the storing of that information for a long period of time. And again, those are very, very specific typically to the country that you're dealing with. So what are some of the topics that are covered in the new survey? Again, I won't read these to you, but you get a feel for these are the general topics that we're covering within the survey. So we'd like to ask you to take the survey. It actually just got sent out, I believe it was yesterday, as an email. So hopefully you received an email in your inbox. Not that you receive a lot of emails anyway. Asking you to take the survey. Some of the things that we're looking at and why we did the survey, some of which I already talked about, are listed here. The actual URL is listed at the bottom of this slide, but Marty at the back of the room has been kind enough to hand out little cards that'll actually give you the URL to take the survey. So we ask that you take a few minutes to take the survey at your leisure. Please don't do it while I'm speaking, but feel free to do it when you're not listening to me. Yes, Michael.
Are you targeting SNIA members, or do you want this as far and wide as possible?
Far and wide as possible.
Okay.
Yeah.
That warrants some outreach.
Absolutely. So I'm glad you mentioned that. So some of the things that we're doing from a marketing perspective, we meaning SNIA, is actually reaching out not just to members of SNIA, but also to end users out there in the community that are not necessarily associated with SNIA at all. And that outreach is happening this week. It'll continue, actually. We'll be promoting it on our website, on the SNIA.org website. We'll be doing a blog later this week with the help of Marty, actually. We'll be blogging about this. We have a hashtag associated with it. We're doing a lot of media campaigning as much as possible to get the word out.
Is there a set time period?
There is. Our plan is to have it live until the end of October, which is the end of next month. And then our other plan is to have the results published early next year, so in the January 2018 timeframe.
Are you tweeting this?
We are tweeting as well. In fact, a tweet just went out this morning, but Marty and some of the other marketing folks have some ideas on some other future tweets this week as well. And we will be blogging about it as well this week. So for those that are interested for additional information regarding the LTR twig, specifically the Long-Term Retention Technical Working Group, I did mention the SIRF specification, which is mentioned here, the Self-Contained Information Retention Format. That was actually a standard that came out of the Long-Term Retention twig. And some other LTR twig related information that's available on our website. Wanted to also thank many of the individuals as well as groups within SNIA that contributed to the creation of the new survey that just went live this week. And some of those folks are listed here. Some of those folks listed are actually not part of SNIA. They're actually external to SNIA. So many thanks to those that took the time to help us craft the questions to make sure that we were asking the right questions and in the right way. Questions? We have a little bit of time. Yes?
So you mentioned that the SIRF is going to the ISO standard, right?
Yes.
And is there any difference between the existing SIRF and the ISO version?
So the question, in case you didn't hear it, is the SIRF, the SIRF specification, is going to ISO to become a global standard. Not finished yet, but the plan is to have that a global standard. The question specifically was, is there going to be a difference to the SIRF specification that came out of the long-term retention twig and the actual ISO version of that specification? And the answer is no, there'll be no difference. Very often ISO, when we do submit, they might have some questions, they might have some comments. There may be some modifications to the specification. Those are typically more grammatical than they are actually changing the actual specification. And that's pretty common, but the actual spec itself will not change.
So another question is
Yep.
that in your slide, so I forget about the page number, but you listed, how to say, several formats for long-term retention, and the SIRF is one of them.
Yes.
And so among those different formats, so do you think that the SIRF is going to be the majority in the future after the ISO standard?
Yeah, great question. So I'll repeat it for those that couldn't hear. So, number one of the statements was there are actually multiple specifications for data formats as a standard for placing the data that you want to retain long term into specific formats. SIRF is only one of those formats. It's not the only one that's available. So the question specifically was, will SIRF, looking ahead forward, will that be used more than any other long-term retention format? Honestly, I can't answer that. From a SNIA perspective, we'd like the answer to be yes, because that's a property that came out of SNIA. How it evolves over time and how it's then developed and then used by individual organizations globally, honestly, I can't predict. But it'll be something that we'll be certainly watching very closely.
So in order to, maintain or SIRF majority, so we need some application to use the SIRF format, right?
Yeah, so,
Is there any activity inside the SNIA
oh, that's a good question.
to make some open source program?
Yes. Yeah, good question. So I will first of all, I will repeat the question in case you didn't hear it. So the major question was, for those that want to use this retention format, SIRF, SIRF, you need to have the ability to have access to that format. There's actually an API that's been developed as part of the SIRF specification, but there's also a version of it called OpenSIRF that's available on GitHub. And in fact, it's listed right here, the second to the last bullet on this slide. So I apologize if I didn't really describe it. I went through this slide fairly quickly, but that was part of when I say our, that means SNIA's contribution to the open source community is the availability of this open source for those organizations that would like to use this as their retention format going forward. Good question, though. You're welcome. Any other questions? We have a little bit more time. Yes?
So, Thomas, I just wanted to mention that if you're in the Bay Area, Thomas will be speaking on this topic in more expanded format in the Store Divisions Conference, which is next month, October 16th, in Milpitas, right? At MCC Suites, I think, yeah. So Thomas is going to be part of a session on talking about long-term archive retention, all of that. So please, sign up for it and come and hear Thomas. And we're also going to have a survey there and be able to come to the booth and talk about it.
Perfect. Great. Thank you, Marty, for mentioning that. I forgot that you signed me up for that, so I'm glad.
I did.
I'm glad you mentioned
I
it.
drafted you.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, Michael.
Do you recall if the survey asks respondees what percentage of their data they consider critical and what they consider expendable in this era of selfies and other high volume, perhaps low value data?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there is one question in there that has to do with asking the respondents, what is the percentage of your data within your organization, corporation, whatever it is that you work for, that is critical to the point where it has to have a policy for long-term retention. So it does ask, sort of in a roundabout way. It's not specific to social media versus other types, but yeah, there is a general question about that.
I'm curious what that will look like.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the respondents come back with. Good question, though. Any other questions? Again, before we break, we have a few more minutes. So we'll be talking about GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, and that'll be a talk right after the break at 3:05 this afternoon, which is actually the next talk. It'll be in Stevens Creek, which is across the hall. I'll be speaking about EU GDPR regulations. If you're interested in some of that, there's actually some tie-ins to archive as it relates to EU General Data Protection Regulations. So if you're interested, feel free to attend that talk as well. That one will be an official tutorial. This one was not a SNIA tutorial. This is just letting you know that a new survey has been generated by the long-term retention twig. So thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day.